Good evening and welcome, beautiful viewer. Wherever you are in the world, whatever the hour on your clock, please find a quiet moment. Settle in. The world outside, with its electric lights and digital hum, can wait. We are about to travel back to a world built of marble and iron, of absolute power and spectacular cruelty, a world that echoes with the roar of a crowd so vast it could shake the foundations of the 7 hills. Perhaps leave a note of the time and place you are listening from. A small marker in the present, before we descend into the dust and the blood of the arena, to understand a nightmare forged in the very heart of civilization itself. A nightmare meticulously engineered, professionally managed, and rapturously consumed by the most powerful empire the world had ever known. We see the image, carved in the defiant marble of a funerary stele, painted in the vibrant, earthy tones of a Pompeian fresco, or immortalized in the gleaming bronze of a statuette, the Gladiator. He stands as a titan of the ancient world, his body a sculpted masterpiece of muscle and sinew, honed by relentless combat, his name chanted by tens of thousands of screaming spectators, his victories and defeats scratched as graffiti onto the plaster walls of taverns and bathhouses with the same fervent adoration reserved for a modern celebrity athlete. He is a symbol of strength, of martial prowess, of a glorious death faced with stoic defiance. The philosopher Seneca wrote of the gladiator's spirit, the discipline to face mortality without flinching. The poet Martial composed epigrams celebrating their fame. Their images adorned oil lamps, glass vessels, and mosaic floors in the homes of the wealthy. They were superstars, monsters of the id, the living embodiment of Rome's fascination with violence, discipline, and the thin, bloody line between life and death. But this is a grand and terrible illusion. It is the glittering, sun-drenched surface of a living hell, a carefully constructed facade designed to mask an underlying reality of unimaginable horror. The glory was the marketing, the fame was the packaging, the reality was a system of human degradation so complete, so legally precise, and so psychologically devastating that it has few parallels in the history of institutionalized cruelty. To understand why being a gladiator was a living nightmare, you must first perform an act of mental archaeology. You must forget the glory. You must excavate beneath the layers of myth, romance, and cinematic heroism. You must begin where the gladiator's story truly began, not with the thunderous roar of the crowd in the Colosseum, but with the deafening, internal silence of a life being systematically and legally erased. The nightmare did not start with the clang of swords in the arena. It began in a provincial courtroom on a blood-soaked battlefield at the misty edge of the empire, or in a squalid back-alley office where a desperate contract was signed in the long, dark shadow of ruinous debt. The nightmare began the moment you ceased to be a person. It began with the loss of your future, the severing of your past, and the annihilation of your present. For the vast majority of men who found themselves on the sand, the path was not one of choice, but of utter desperation or total subjugation. Imagine yourself a warrior from a Germanic tribe, a Chatti or a Marcomanni, your world, the deep, dark forests east of the Rhine. You have fought the legions with a ferocity born of a desire to protect your home, your kin, your gods. But Roman discipline, Roman steel, and Roman logistics are relentless. Your shield wall is broken, your chieftain is slain, your comrades lie dead or dying around you. The disciplined, red-shielded legionaries swarm over your position. You are clubbed into submission, your hands bound tightly behind your back with leather thongs that cut into your wrists. You have become captivus, a captive, a spoil of war. Your journey to the heart of the empire is a long, brutal, and dehumanizing ordeal. Chained together in a long coffle with your fellow survivors, you are marched for weeks, even months, across lands you have never seen. You are fed scraps, exposed to the elements, and prodded along by soldiers who see you not as a defeated enemy warrior, but as livestock being driven to market. Your first sight of a true Roman city, with its towering stone aqueducts, its paved roads, and its sheer, overwhelming scale, is a profound psychological blow. It is the architecture of a power so immense it makes your tribe's resistance seem like a child's tantrum. Your final degradation comes in the city of Rome itself. If you are particularly tall, strong, or exotic looking, you might be selected for a special honor to be paraded in the general's triumph. This was Rome's highest military celebration, a magnificent procession that wound through the city streets to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. The victorious general, his face painted red like the god himself, rides in a chariot, preceded by senators, musicians, and wagons laden with the spoils of his campaign, captured weapons, gold, silver, and works of art. And preceding his chariot are the most important spoils of all, you and your fellow captives, chained and miserable, living trophies to be gaped at by the Roman mob. They jeer at you, they mock your strange clothing and your long hair, they celebrate your defeat as a confirmation of their own divinely ordained supremacy. You are a walking symbol of Rome's power to dominate and absorb all peoples. After the triumph, you are taken to the slave market. Here, stripped naked on a rotating platform, your body is inspected by potential buyers. Your teeth are checked, your muscles are prodded, your scars are examined. A placard, a titulus, hangs around your neck, listing your origin, your age, and any special skills. You hear the auctioneer's call, the haggling of the buyers. You are no longer a warrior. You are no longer even a man. You are an object, a piece of merchandise, and the man who buys you, a stern-faced figure with calculating eyes, is a lanista, a purveyor of gladiators. He does not see a human being, he sees raw material, an investment with the potential for a high, if bloody, return. Or perhaps your journey began not in the forests of Germania, but within the empire's borders. You are a citizen, or perhaps a provincial, a resident of a teeming city like Alexandria or Antioch. You have committed a capital crime. Maybe it was murder in a drunken brawl, or arson to cover a debt, or armed robbery on a lonely road. Maybe you were part of a rebellious faction, a political dissident who backed the wrong man in a civil war. Or maybe you committed sacrilege, desecrating a temple or belonging to a forbidden religious sect, like the early Christians, who were often condemned for their refusal to worship the emperor. You are arrested, tried, and found guilty. For the upper classes, a capital sentence might mean a quiet, dignified exile or a relatively swift execution by the sword. For you, a member of the lower classes, the humiliores, the state has devised more imaginative and terrifying punishments designed to serve as a public deterrent. The magistrate, his face a mask of bored indifference, utters the words of your sentence, damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the gladiatorial school. This was not simply a sentence to become a gladiator, it was a specific form of the death penalty. It was a legal acknowledgement that your life was forfeit to the state, but that the state had chosen to execute you in a slow, spectacular, and entertaining fashion. You were now a damnatus, a condemned man, your life no longer your own but the property of the Roman people, to be disposed of in the arena for their pleasure. This sentence placed you in a unique legal purgatory. Unlike a common slave, who still retained a flicker of legal personhood, you were considered already dead in the eyes of the law. You were a walking corpse, your continued existence merely a temporary deferment of your execution, a deferment that would last only as long as you could continue to fight and kill entertainingly. The sentence was, in theory, for a limited time, perhaps 3 to 5 years. If, by some miracle of skill, luck, and savagery, you survived that long, you might be freed. But the odds were astronomically against you. The entire system was designed to ensure you would die long before your sentence was up, providing a steady stream of fresh bodies for the sand. There was a third, and in many ways, most psychologically disturbing path into the arena. This was the path of the volunteer, the octoratus. You were a free man, perhaps even a Roman citizen, who, for reasons of your own, chose to enter this living hell. Why would any sane person make such a choice? The reasons were almost always rooted in desperation. You might be a former soldier, discharged from the legions without a pension, possessing no skills other than the ability to fight. You might be a farmer whose small plot of land had been swallowed up by a wealthy landowner's vast estate, a common story in the late Republic and early Empire. You might be a tradesman, crushed by a mountain of debt, facing starvation and the shame of being unable to provide for your family. For these men, the ludus represented a final, desperate gamble. It offered the promise of food, of shelter, and, if you were one of the infinitesimal few who became a champion, the possibility of fame and prize money that could clear your debts and restore your life. To become an auctoratus, you had to approach a lannister and sign a formal contract, the auctoramentum. This was a legal act of self-annihilation. You would stand before witnesses and swear a terrible oath, an oath that has been preserved by the Roman writer Petronius, Uri, Vincere, Verberari, Feroque Necari, to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. With this oath, you voluntarily surrendered your body and your freedom. You agreed to submit to the absolute authority of the lannister, to endure any punishment he saw fit to inflict, and to accept the possibility of a violent death in the arena. You agreed to become his property for a specified period. In exchange, you received a signing bonus, a sum of money that might have seemed enormous to a destitute man, but which was, in reality, simply the price of your soul. This act was a form of social suicide. By signing the auctoramentum, you willingly accepted the status of infamia. You became legally dishonored, sacrificing your rights as a free man for a chance at survival. Your family would be shamed. Your name would be disgraced. You had chosen to live as a slave in the hope of one day being free again, a paradox that lay at the twisted heart of the volunteer's choice. You were gambling not just with your life, but with your very identity as a human being. Whatever the path that led you to this point, conquest, condemnation, or contract, the destination was the same. It was a doorway through which you passed, and the person you were before did not, could not follow. The first, most fundamental act of this new existence was the stripping away of your identity, a process as systematic as it was brutal. And the first thing they took from you was your name. Your name was the essential thread that connected you to your past. It was the name your mother had given you, the name your father had passed down, the name that tied you to your family, your ancestors, your tribe, your home. It was the unique sound in all the world that signified you. The Romans, masters of psychological control, understood the power of this connection, and they cut that thread with ruthless efficiency. You were no longer Lucius Aemilius of the Scaptian tribe. You were no longer Crixus, the proud Gaul from Allobrogia. You were no longer even Sextus, the indebted farmer from Apulia. Your old name was buried, forgotten, forbidden. You were given a new name, a stage name, a brand. These names were often simple, brutal, and designed to be easily chanted by a drunken, roaring crowd. They were drawn from myth, from animals, or from abstract concepts of violence and speed. You might be called Achilles, or Hector, or Ajax, a cruel irony that compared your squalid, servile existence to the epic heroes of old. You might be named after a beast, Tigris, tiger, Leo, lion, or Ursus, bear, reducing you to the level of the wild animals you might one day be forced to fight. Or, most commonly, you were given a name that was simply an adjective, a descriptor of the product you were supposed to become. Flamma, flame. Sealer, swift. Ferox, fierce. Victor, victor. Priscus, ancient one. Verus, true one. You were no longer a man with a complex history and an inner life. You were a one-word marketing concept, a label on a piece of fighting meat. This renaming was the first and most profound act of dehumanization. It was a declaration that your past life, everything that had made you who you were, was now officially null and void. With your name went your history. Your life before this moment, your memories of family, of freedom, of home, were now a story that had officially ended, a private ghost that you were expected to exorcise. Your wife and children, you were now legally dead to them. Your ancestral gods, you would now be expected to make offerings to the gods of your oppressors, to Nemesis, the goddess of fate and vengeance who presided over the arena, and to the divine spirit of the emperor, the man in whose name these bloody spectacles were staged. The laws that had once protected you, even in a limited way, as a citizen or a slave, no longer applied. You had entered a new legal category, a state of being that was the true foundational horror of the gladiator's existence. You were now legally and publicly infamis. The concept of infamia in Roman law was not simply a matter of having a bad reputation, it was a specific, formal legal status, a brand of profound dishonor that marked you as a person existing outside the pale of respectable society. You shared this status with other marginal figures, with actors whose profession was seen as inherently deceitful and effeminate, with prostitutes who sold their bodies for money, with pimps and procurers, and with undertakers who dealt with the pollution of death. To be infamous meant you were stripped of your civic rights and your moral standing. You could not vote in an election. You could not stand for public office. You could not act as a witness in a court of law. You could not make a will or inherit property in the normal way. You were a pariah, a person whose word had no weight, whose honor had no value. For the gladiator, infamia was absolute. You were a living paradox, a figure of immense public fascination and fame, yet simultaneously a person of the lowest possible social and legal standing. The same Roman aristocrat who might pay a fortune to have a mosaic of your face installed on his bathroom floor would be socially contaminated by your very presence at his dinner table. You were celebrated for your courage in the arena, yet you were legally defined by your disgrace. This duality was at the heart of the Roman attitude towards gladiators. They were objects of both adoration and contempt, heroes and untouchables, gods of the sand and scum of the earth. This legal and social annihilation was perhaps even more terrifying than the physical violence of the arena, because it was a violence done to your very soul. It was a constant, gnawing reminder that in the eyes of the world, you were no longer truly human. You were a tool, a weapon, a spectacle. You were a thing. So, stripped of your name, your past, your rights, and your honor, you were led in chains alongside the other broken men, the other human ghosts who had suffered the same erasure towards your new home. This was the ludus gladiatorium, the gladiatorial school. The very name was a cruel joke. Ludus can mean school, but it can also mean game or play. Your life was now a game. Your school was a place where you learned how to die playfully for the amusement of others. The ludus was not a heroic training ground or a noble military academy. It was a high-security prison, a factory designed for the mass production of violent death. The great gladiatorial schools, like the Ludus Magnus built by the Emperor Domitian right next to the Colosseum, were formidable structures. They were surrounded by high walls, often topped with sharpened stakes. There were watchtowers manned by guards. The living quarters for the gladiators, the cellae, were small, cramped, barred cells, often located underground or on the ground floor, far from any possibility of escape. You would be locked in these cells at night, sometimes still in chains. The moment you passed through the great, heavy gates of the ludus, you entered a world of total and absolute control. Your life was now governed by an ironclad discipline enforced by a hierarchy of brutal overseers. At the top was the lanista, the owner of the school. He was your master, your god. He was a businessman whose product was your flesh and blood. He had invested a significant amount of money in you, your purchase price, the cost of your food, your training, your medical care, and he expected a return on that investment. He would see you either die in the arena, generating ticket revenue and public acclaim, or become so valuable that he could rent you out to promoters for exorbitant fees. Beneath him was the doctor or trainer, a veteran ex-gladiator who was responsible for your physical conditioning and combat training. And beneath them all were the guards and overseers, the familiar gladiatoria, men armed with whips and clubs, whose job it was to enforce the rules and punish any infraction with immediate and savage violence. Imagine the atmosphere inside those walls. The air would be thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, of sweat, of fear, of stale food, of blood, and of the harsh tang of the coarse sand used on the training ground. The sounds would be a constant cacophony, the clash of wooden training weapons, the grunts and shouts of men pushing their bodies to the breaking point, the crack of the overseer's whip, the groans of the injured, and the low, desperate murmuring of dozens of different languages, Gallic, Germanic, Thracian, Dacian, from men torn from every corner of the sprawling empire. This was a place of intense rivalry, of suspicion, of simmering violence. The man you shared a cell with today might be the man you were forced to kill in the arena tomorrow. Trust was a liability. Friendship was a weakness. The entire system was designed to isolate you, to break down any bonds of solidarity, and to remake you into a solitary killing machine. As the great, heavy gates of the ludus boomed shut behind you, the sound was not just of wood and iron striking stone. It was the sound of the world, your world, being locked out forever. It was the sound of your past being sealed in a tomb. The man you once were, the warrior, the farmer, the citizen, the father, the son, was gone. He was a casualty, a ghost haunting the ruins of a life that no longer existed. Now, in this suffocating, violent, and hopeless new reality, the Lannister and his trainers would begin their true work. They would begin the methodical and monstrous process of forging the thing that would take his place. They would teach you how to hold a shield, how to wield a sword, how to kill efficiently. But more than that, they would teach you how to die. They would teach you how to die correctly, how to die entertainingly, how to die in a way that would make the crowd roar its approval. Your body was now a canvas, and over the next weeks and months, they would paint upon it a masterpiece of spectacular death. The nightmare had found its stage. The erasure was complete. The man you had been was a ghost, a fading memory whose existence was a liability in this new, brutal reality. Now began the second phase of the nightmare, the reconstruction. Inside the suffocating, high-walled world of the ludus, the Lannister and his trainers initiated the methodical and monstrous process of forging a new creature from the raw material of your despair. This was not education. It was a form of violent alchemy, a process designed to transmute a broken human being into a valuable commodity, a saleable spectacle of death. It was a regimen that would push your body past every conceivable limit and systematically dismantle your mind, replacing fear with a cold, functional rage and individuality with a rigid, weaponized persona. This was the birth of the Gladiator, and it was a birth more terrifying than any death. The first principle of your new life was a diet designed not for health, but for effect. You were now a member of the Horderii, the barley men. The name was a sneering descriptor used by outsiders, but it was brutally accurate. The core of your diet was a thick, glutinous porridge made from barley, supplemented with beans, oats, and perhaps some dried fruit. Meat was a rarity, a luxury you might taste only on the eve of a fight. This high-carbohydrate, low-protein diet was not an accident, nor was it a simple matter of cost-cutting by the Lannister. It was a calculated strategy with a dual purpose, both practical and grotesque. Firstly, it was designed to build bulk. The relentless consumption of barley and beans would pack a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over your muscles. This layer of fat served a grimly practical purpose in the arena. It was a protective cushion, a shallow cut from an opponent's blade, a slash that might slice through the skin and muscle of a leaner man, would instead be absorbed by this layer of adipose tissue. It meant you could sustain more superficial wounds, bleed more spectacularly for the crowd, without being immediately disabled by a cut to a vital muscle or tendon. Your body was being deliberately engineered to prolong the spectacle of its own destruction. You were being fattened up like a prize hog, not for slaughter, but for a more elaborate and entertaining form of butchery. The second purpose of this diet was psychological. The bland, monotonous, and heavy food was another tool of control. It kept you sluggish, docile, and dependent. It was fuel for the machine, not sustenance for a man. It was a constant, visceral reminder of your status as something less than human, as livestock being prepared for a specific, violent purpose. While the poets and aristocrats of Rome were reclining on their couches, feasting on dormice in honey, roasted peacock, and spiced wine, you were hunched over a wooden bowl, forcing down another mouthful of tasteless leaden mush. This dietary regimen was the foundation upon which your new body would be built, a body designed to look formidable, to bleed impressively, and to die slowly. Upon this foundation of barley and beans, the true work began. The training was relentless, a dawn-to-dusk cycle of pain and exhaustion designed to break you down and rebuild you according to a specific, deadly template. The training ground, the sandy floor of the ludus courtyard, became the entire world. Your day was governed not by the sun, but by the bellowed commands of the doctores, the trainers. These were often former gladiators themselves, men who had somehow survived their time on the sand, perhaps earning their freedom with the coveted wooden sword, the rudis. But survival had not made them compassionate. It had made them hard, cynical, and utterly brutal. They were the living proof that the system worked, and their job was to ensure its continuation. They carried a long wooden staff, the virga, a symbol of their authority, which they used without hesitation to beat any recruit who was slow, clumsy, or defiant. The initial phase of training was a brutal physical conditioning designed to weed out the weak. You would be forced to run endless circuits around the training yard, to lift heavy stones or lead weights until your muscles screamed, to perform grueling calisthenics, all under the watchful, unforgiving eye of the trainers. Any sign of weakness, of fatigue, of complaint was met with a lash of the whip or a crack of the staff. This was not just about building strength, it was about instilling absolute, unquestioning obedience. You were being taught to subordinate your body's own signals of pain and exhaustion to the will of your masters. Your pain was irrelevant. Your limits were to be broken, not respected. Men would collapse from heat stroke, suffer hernias, tear muscles, and break bones. Those who could not endure this initial breaking in period, whose bodies simply gave out under the strain, were a failed investment. Their fate was grim. They might be relegated to the menial drudgery of the ludus, or perhaps sold off cheaply to work in the mines, a death sentence of a different but no less certain kind. Once your body was hardened and your spirit sufficiently cowed, you would be introduced to the weapons. But you would not begin with the sharp steel of the arena. You would begin with the arma lusoria, the training weapons. These were replicas of the real weapons, but made of wood and often weighted with lead to be significantly heavier than their steel counterparts. You would be handed a wooden sword, the rudis, and a wicker shield, and your true training would commence. The extra weight of the weapons was another calculated cruelty. It made the training even more exhausting, building the specific muscles and endurance needed for combat. But more importantly, it meant that when you were finally handed the real, lighter steel weapons in the arena, they would feel unnaturally swift and agile in your hands, a final psychological trick to bolster your confidence before the moment of truth. The core of your training was repetition, endless drills known as prolucio. You would spend hours, day after day, practicing the fundamental movements, the basic stances, the parries, the thrusts, the cuts. Your first opponent was not another man, but a heavy wooden post set in the ground, the palace. This was your silent, unmoving partner in the dance of death. You would circle it, attack it, defend against its imaginary blows for hours on end until every movement was an ingrained, unthinking reflex. The doctor would stand nearby, critiquing your every move, correcting your form with a sharp word or a sharper blow from his staff. Don't expose your flank. Keep your shield up. Thrust, don't slash, you fool. The goal was to strip away any natural, undisciplined fighting style you may have had from your previous life as a soldier or a brawler. That was inefficient. That was unpredictable. The Romans despised unpredictability. They were creating not just a fighter, but a performer, and your performance had to adhere to a specific, recognizable script. This script was defined by your type. A gladiator was not just a generic swordsman. He was a highly specialized combatant, a member of a specific class or armatura, each with its own unique set of equipment, its own prescribed fighting style, and its own traditional opponent. The lanista and his doctoress would study your physique, your agility, your strength, and your temperament, and then assign you a role, a persona that you would inhabit for the rest of your short life. This was one of the most insidious aspects of the gladiator's nightmare. You were not just being taught to fight, you were being forced into a costume, a character in a violent play, and your role would often be a cruel parody of your own origins. Were you a Thracian, captured in the wars on the Balkan frontier? You would be made into a Thraex. You would be equipped with a small, square shield, a crested helmet with a distinctive griffin on top, and the weapon that was a symbol of your people, the seeker, a short, curved sword designed to slash around an opponent's shield. You were being forced to perform a stylized, Romanized version of your own ethnic identity, a living caricature of the barbarian warrior for the amusement of your conquerors. Were you a Gaul, tall and strong? You might be made into a murmillo. You would carry the large rectangular shield, the scutum of a Roman legionary, and the short stabbing sword, the gladius that had conquered your homeland. You would wear a heavy bronze helmet with a fish-like crest, a reference to the sea fish you were supposed to resemble. Your role was to play the part of the heavily armed, disciplined soldier, a twisted homage to the very army that had enslaved you. Or perhaps, if you were quick and agile, you would be cast in the most famous and bizarre role of all, the retiarius, the netman. The retiarius was the lightest armed of all gladiators, and his equipment was a strange parody of a fisherman's gear. He fought almost naked, wearing only a loincloth and a metal guard, the gallerus, on his left shoulder. His weapons were a weighted net, the reti, which he used to entangle his opponent, a long, three-pronged trident, the fuschina, and a small dagger, the pugio. The retiarius was a figure of ambiguity and transgression. He was fast, elusive, and his fighting style was seen as tricky and effeminate by Roman traditionalists. He fought with his face uncovered, his identity visible to the crowd, which made him both vulnerable and strangely charismatic. His traditional opponent was the secutor, the pursuer, a variation of the murmillo whose helmet was smooth and round, with only two tiny eye holes, designed specifically to prevent it from being snagged by the net. The pairing of these different types was the core of the spectacle. The contest was deliberately asymmetrical, a carefully engineered matchup of contrasting strengths and weaknesses. The heavy armor and powerful sword of the secutor versus the speed and ranged weapons of the retiarius. The small shield and curved blade of the thraex versus the large shield and straight blade of the murmillo. Each matchup was a tactical puzzle, a live-action chess game of death. Your training would be focused entirely on defeating your designated opposite. You would learn the specific weaknesses of your opponent's armor, the predictable angles of his attack, the moments of opportunity when he was off balance. You drilled these scenarios relentlessly, day after day, until the responses were burned into your nervous system. This specialization was another form of dehumanization. It reduced you to a set of functions, a cog in the machine of the games. You were not a complete warrior. You were a thraex or a retiarius. Your identity was now defined by your equipment. The helmet, with its fantastical crests and its suffocating, vision-restricting design, was a key part of this. When you put on that helmet, you were not just protecting your head, you were putting on a mask. You were subsuming your own identity into the role you were forced to play. The world narrowed to the thin slits of your visor. The roar of the crowd was muffled, distant. Your own breathing was loud, ragged in your ears. You were alone, trapped inside the bronze shell of your new persona. The psychological pressure of this training was immense. You lived in a state of constant low-grade terror, punctuated by moments of acute violence. The discipline was absolute. The slightest mistake in training could earn you a beating. A moment of defiance could lead to flogging, or being branded with a hot iron, a permanent mark of your slave status. The brand was not just a punishment, it was another part of the marketing. A sign to the world that you were a trained, professional product of a reputable ludus. Escape was almost impossible, and the penalty for attempting it was a death of unimaginable cruelty. Crucifixion, or being thrown to the wild beasts in the arena, unarmed and defenseless. A form of execution called damnatio ad bestias. You were surrounded by death and the prospect of death. The ludus had its own infirmary and doctors, but their primary purpose was not to heal you out of compassion, but to patch you up and get you back into fighting shape as quickly as possible. They were masters of treating the specific kinds of trauma that gladiators suffered: sword wounds, broken bones, torn ligaments. But they were also part of the system, their medical skills employed to maximize the lanista's investment. A gladiator who was too badly maimed to fight again was a financial loss, a piece of damaged goods to be discarded. In this world of constant violence, physical hardship, and psychological abuse, you were being systematically reforged. The trainers were deliberately trying to foster a state of controlled, murderous aggression. They were teaching you to channel your fear, your despair, and your hatred into a focused, efficient rage that could be unleashed on command in the arena. You were being conditioned to see the man standing opposite you not as another human being, another victim of the same cruel system, but as an obstacle, a thing to be destroyed. The bonds of common humanity were a weakness the ludus could not afford to tolerate, and yet, paradoxically, in this shared hell, bonds did form. Men from opposite ends of the empire, who shared no language and no history, could form a strange kind of camaraderie, a fellowship of the damned. They might share a morsel of food, or help dress a wound, or simply exchange a look of shared understanding in the face of their hopeless situation. Small plaques and tombstones commissioned by gladiators for their fallen comrades attest to these fragile connections. A gladiator might refer to a fallen opponent as his sedalis, his comrade, a poignant acknowledgement of their shared fate. But these fleeting moments of humanity were an anomaly, a quiet rebellion against a system designed to stamp them out. The primary lesson of the ludus was a brutal one. Your survival depended on another man's death. This was the terrible calculus that you were being forced to internalize, the monstrous logic that would govern your every action when you finally stepped out of the darkness of the training school and into the blinding, unforgiving light of the arena. The day would come. After weeks, months, perhaps even years of the relentless grind of the ludus, of the barley porridge, the wooden swords, and the overseer's whip, the lanista would decide that his investment was ready to mature. Your name, your new, brutal stage name, would be posted on the list for the upcoming munus, the gladiatorial games. The word munus meant a duty, a gift, or an offering to the dead. And that is what you were about to become. A bloody offering, a human sacrifice laid on the altar of public amusement to honor the memory of a dead aristocrat, or to celebrate the glory of the emperor. The final days leading up to your debut were a surreal and terrifying ritual, a carefully orchestrated psychological procession designed to fatten you up for the slaughter, display you like a prize beast, and strip away the very last vestiges of your humanity before you were thrust into the abattoir. The announcement of the games would be a grand public affair. Painted advertisements known as edicta monerum would appear on the walls of buildings throughout the city. These were the promotional posters of the ancient world, rendered in bold red and black letters by professional signwriters. They would announce the name of the magistrate or nobleman who was sponsoring the games, the occasion being celebrated, the number of gladiator pairs scheduled to fight, and any special attractions, such as wild beast hunts or public executions. And on that poster, listed among the other combatants, would be your name. Seeing it there, in stark black letters for all the city to read, would be a moment of chilling finality. You were no longer a trainee hidden behind the walls of the ludus. You were now a public commodity, your impending death a subject of casual speculation and gambling among the citizenry. Men would place bets on your survival or on the manner of your death with the same detached interest they might bet on a chariot race. Your life had become a line in a ledger, a wager in a game of chance. The night before the games, a strange and unsettling tradition took place, the cena libera, the free dinner. On this final night, the gladiators who were scheduled to fight the next day were given a lavish banquet. After a diet of monotonous barley mush, you were suddenly presented with an abundance of rich food, roasted meats, fine breads, fruits, and, most importantly, copious amounts of strong wine. This was not an act of kindness. It was a calculated part of the spectacle, a final piece of psychological theatre with multiple sinister purposes. Firstly, it was a public relations event. The banquet was often open to the public, or at least to paying spectators from the upper classes. Curious citizens, morbid thrill seekers, and hardened gamblers would come to stare at the men who were about to die. They would observe you, critique your physique, comment on your demeanor, and size up your chances, much like modern horse racing enthusiasts inspecting the thoroughbreds in the paddock before a race. You were on display, a piece of meat being inspected one last time before it was thrown on the grill. The banquet also served to fatten you up and bolster your courage, or at least create a temporary, alcohol-fueled bravado. A belly full of rich food and wine was thought to make a man fight with more vigor. But for the gladiators themselves, the experience must have been profoundly surreal and disturbing. The Roman writer Plutarch describes the scene. He says that some men would feast greedily, indulging in a final sensory pleasure before the void. But others, he notes, would be too consumed by fear and despair to eat. They would sit in stony silence, their minds fixed on the horrors of the coming day. Some would use this last night to dictate messages to their loved ones, entrusting a final farewell to a sympathetic guard or a Lannister's scribe. They would make provisions for their meager possessions or for their own burial, should their body be retrievable. It was a night of forced public festivity that was, in reality, a living wake. You were surrounded by the sights and sounds of a feast, but you were attending your own funeral. The laughter of the spectators, the taste of the roasted pork, the warmth of the wine, all of it would be saturated with the cold, metallic taste of impending death. The next morning, the day of the games, you would be awakened before dawn. There would be no final meal, no moment of quiet contemplation. The day began with another public spectacle, the Pompa. This was the grand procession that officially opened the games. It was a parade designed to whip the crowd into a frenzy and to showcase the wealth and power of the sponsor, the editor. The procession would wind its way from a public space in the city to the amphitheatre. It was led by lictors, the ceremonial bodyguards of a Roman magistrate, their bundles of rods and axes symbolizing the state's power over life and death. Then came trumpeters and horn players, filling the air with a martial fanfare. Then came carts laden with the weapons and armor to be used in the combat, polished to a brilliant shine. Then came priests, carrying statues of the gods who would preside over the slaughter, most notably Nemesis, the winged goddess of retribution. And then came you. You and your fellow gladiators would march in the Pompa, dressed not in your fighting armor, but in elaborate, brightly colored robes of purple and gold, embroidered with intricate patterns. This was your costume for the opening act, another layer of unreality designed to transform you from a condemned slave into a glorious performer. You marched in a solemn, dignified procession, your head held high, your expression a mask of grim determination. You were expected to look the part of a hero, a willing participant in this grand ceremony. The streets would be lined with thousands of spectators, the entire city seemingly turned out to watch you on your final journey. They would cheer, they would shout your name, they would throw flowers. It was a grotesque parody of a general's triumph, a general paraded to celebrate a victory he had won. You were parading towards your own probable destruction. The adoration of the crowd was not for you, the man, it was for the spectacle you were about to provide. Their cheers were the applause for the overture of an opera in which you were the tragic, dying lead. As the procession entered the immense, cavernous structure of the amphitheatre, the Colosseum in Rome, or one of the dozens of smaller but equally deadly arenas scattered across the empire, the roar of the crowd would become a physical force, a wall of sound that vibrated in your bones. An amphitheatre was an architectural marvel, a masterpiece of Roman engineering designed for a single purpose: the efficient and spectacular display of mass death. Its elliptical shape ensured that every spectator, from the emperor in his gilded box to the poorest plebeian in the highest, steepest tier of seats, had a clear and unobstructed view of the carnage on the sand below. It was a democratic space in the most terrifying sense of the word. It gave everyone an equal opportunity to witness your suffering. The procession would circle the arena floor, the harina. The name harina means sand, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of it, designed to soak up the vast quantities of blood that were about to be spilled. As you made your final circuit, you would pass the imperial box, the pulvinar. Here, you and your fellow gladiators would stop, raise your right arm in a formal salute, and deliver the famous, chilling line that has echoed down through history: Ave Imperator, moriturita salutant. Hail, Emperor, we who are about to die salute you. This phrase, often romanticized as an expression of defiant courage, was in reality the ultimate statement of your subjugation. It was a formal acknowledgement of your status. You were the morituri, the dying ones. Your death was a foregone conclusion, and you were saluting the man, the living God, in whose name and for whose pleasure you were about to perish. It was the final, formal surrender of your will, a public declaration that your life was now utterly forfeit. After the Pompa, the games would begin, but you would not be the first act. The day's events were carefully structured to build excitement and anticipation. The morning's entertainment was often the venaciones, the wild beast hunts. From trapdoors in the arena floor, a dizzying array of exotic and terrifying animals, captured at immense expense from the farthest corners of the empire, would be released. Lions from North Africa, tigers from Parthia, bears from Caledonia, leopards, crocodiles, rhinos, even elephants. They would be hunted and killed by specially trained beast fighters, the venatores and the bestiarii. This was a spectacle designed to showcase Rome's dominion not just over all peoples, but over the natural world itself. It was a symbolic reenactment of the taming of the wilderness. Following the Venationes, around midday, came the Meridiani, the midday spectacles. This was often considered the low point of the day's entertainment, a time when many of the wealthier spectators might leave for lunch. For those who remained, the show was of a different, more squalid kind of horror. This was the time for the public executions. Condemned criminals, the noxii, would be brought out into the arena to meet their end in a variety of gruesome and imaginative ways. Some would be subjected to damnatio ad bestias, tied to stakes and mauled to death by starved lions or bears. Others would be forced to participate in fatal charades, elaborate and cruel theatrical reenactments of mythological scenes. A criminal might be dressed as Orpheus and torn apart by bears instead of maenads. Another, dressed as the hero Hercules, might be burned alive on a pyre. The most infamous of these midday entertainments was the spectacle of condemned criminals being forced to kill each other. Two unarmed men would be brought out. One would be handed a sword and ordered to kill the other. Once he had done so, his sword would be taken away and given to a new man, who would then be ordered to kill him. This would continue, a human conveyor belt of slaughter, until the last man was dispatched by a soldier. The Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger was once forced to attend the Meridiani and was left profoundly disgusted and shaken. He wrote, "In the morning, they throw men to the lions and the bears. At noon, they throw them to the spectators. The spectators demand that the slayer shall be thrown to another to be slain, and they reserve the victor for another slaughter. The outcome for the combatants is death. The fight is waged with sword and fire. This is what happens while the arena is empty." This was the context in which you waited for your own turn. All morning, while you were huddled in the dark, damp holding cells beneath the arena stands, the carceres, you would have been able to hear the sounds from above, the roar of the crowd, the trumpets' blare, the snarling of the great cats, and the screams of the dying. The air would be thick with the coppery smell of blood seeping down through the sand-covered floorboards. You were waiting in a charnel house, listening to the overture of your own destruction. The midday executions served a specific purpose in relation to your own impending fight. They were designed to numb the crowd, to desensitize them to the sight of death, and to whet their appetite for the main event, the nobler spectacle of skilled one-on-one combat. The deaths of the noxii were cheap, artless. Your death, it was hoped, would be a skilled performance. Finally, the moment would arrive. A trumpet would sound, the gate of your cell would be wrenched open, an attendant would lead you out into a gloomy subterranean passage known as the Gate of Life, the Porta Sana Vivaria. As you walked down this tunnel, you would see the blinding rectangle of light at the far end, the entrance to the arena floor. The roar of the crowd, muffled until now, would hit you with the force of a physical blow. You would squint, your eyes struggling to adjust to the brilliant sunlight after the darkness of the cells. You would take a deep breath, the air tasting of hot dust and old blood. You would walk through that gate, your wooden training sword replaced by a cold, heavy, sharpened piece of steel. Your wicker shield replaced by a solid plank of wood faced with leather and rimmed with bronze. You had passed through the final gateway. The nightmare had ceased to be a future prospect. It was now your present, all-encompassing reality. You were on the sand. Across the vast expanse, you would see your opponent, another man who had endured the same erasure, the same brutal training, the same terrifying procession. He was a mirror image of your own despair. The editor would give the signal, a trumpet would sound a final, piercing blast, and the fight for your life, or rather, the performance of your death, would begin. The light was a physical assault. After the cool, subterranean gloom of the carceres, the holding cells beneath the stands, The brilliant, unforgiving glare of the Italian sun reflecting off the pale sand was a disorienting shock. Your pupils, accustomed to the dark, would shrink to pinpricks, momentarily blurring the scene before you into a shifting wash of color and light. But it was the sound that truly overwhelmed the senses. The roar of the crowd was not a noise you heard with your ears. It was a physical pressure, a vibration that resonated deep in your chest and rattled your teeth. It was the sound of 50, 60, even 80,000 human beings, a collective entity united by a single, insatiable appetite for violence. It was a monstrous, composite voice, a baying, howling, screaming beast that surrounded you on all sides, pressing in from the tiered, canyon-like walls of the amphitheater. In that moment, standing on the hot sand, the sheer, crushing scale of the spectacle would become terrifyingly clear. You were not a warrior about to engage in a duel. You were a single, insignificant actor pushed onto the center of a vast, blood-soaked stage, a sacrificial victim for a city-sized god with tens of thousands of mouths. Your opponent stood across the expanse of the arena. He was a man you may have known, a man you may have trained alongside for months in the claustrophobic confines of the ludus. Perhaps you had shared a meal or exchanged a few gruff words. Perhaps you had even felt a flicker of camaraderie, a shared understanding of your mutual damnation. All of that was now irrelevant. In this space, he was not your fellow victim. He was the living embodiment of your death, and you were his. The Lannister's training, the endless drills against the Palus, the systematic dehumanization, it all converged on this single, terrible imperative. You must kill him to survive another day. The trumpet, which had signaled the start of the pompa and the executions, would sound one final, piercing blast. There were no further pleasantries, no declarations of honor. The performance had begun. The first moments of combat were a frantic, desperate calculus of survival. Your body, conditioned by the heavy wooden training weapons, would feel unnaturally light, your steel sword an extension of your will. But your mind would be a whirlwind of terror and adrenaline. The fight was not a chaotic brawl. It was a deadly, tactical dance, governed by the strict conventions of your assigned armatura. If you were a secutor, your world was a narrow, suffocating slit. Your smooth, heavy helmet protected you from the Retiarius's net, but it was an oven trapping your hot, ragged breath. Your vision was severely restricted, a tunnel through which you had to track your quick, elusive opponent. The roar of the crowd was a muffled, oceanic thunder. Your primary sensation was the feeling of your own sweat stinging your eyes, the desperate gasping for air inside your own bronze skull. Your goal was to close the distance, to trap the nimble netman against the wall of the arena, the podium, and bring your heavy shield and short, stabbing gladius to bear. You were a tank, a relentless, grinding force of pressure. If you were the Retiarius, your experience was the polar opposite. You were exposed, almost naked, your face and body visible to every single spectator. You felt the sun on your skin, the grit of the sand under your feet. You could see the expressions on the faces in the front rows. You could hear every jeer, every shout of encouragement. You were a performer without a mask, your fear and exertion on full display. Your survival depended on constant movement, on maintaining distance, on your skill with the weighted net. You would whirl the rate, letting it spread out like a spider's web, looking for the perfect moment to cast it over your heavily armored pursuer. A successful cast was a moment of triumph. Your opponent, entangled and struggling, was suddenly vulnerable to the 3 sharp points of your trident. But a miss was a disaster. The net was heavy and cumbersome to retrieve, and a failed cast left you with only your trident and a small dagger to fend off the implacable advance of the fully armored secutor. Your fight was one of speed, cunning, and nerve, a high-stakes gamble with every throw of the net. The combat was a series of short, explosive flurries, punctuated by moments of tense circling, of probing, of waiting for an opening. The goal was not necessarily to kill your opponent immediately. The perfect fight from the perspective of the editor and the crowd was one that was long, evenly matched, and filled with dramatic reversals of fortune. It was about creating a narrative. The crowd wanted to see skill, courage, and above all, blood. The first wound was a pivotal moment. The sight of blood, The cruor would elicit a roar of approval from the stands. A cut on your arm, a gash on your leg. Your body was now part of the story. Its slow destruction, the plot. The thick layer of fat from your barley diet would absorb the initial slashes, the blood flowing freely, but the damage often superficial. This was by design. It allowed for a bloodier, more protracted spectacle. The fight would be overseen by a referee, the summa ludus, another veteran gladiator, identifiable by his white tunic and his long staff. He and his assistants were there to enforce the rules of the specific matchup, to separate fighters if they became locked in a stalemate, and to ensure the combat remained clean and entertaining. If a gladiator was disarmed, for instance, the referee might pause the fight to allow him to retrieve his weapon, prolonging the contest. But his primary role was to interpret the flow of the fight and ultimately the will of the crowd. As the fight wore on, exhaustion would become your greatest enemy. The heavy armor of a murmillo or a secutor, weighing as much as 50 or 60 pounds, would become an unbearable burden under the blazing sun. Your shield arm would feel like lead. Your lungs would burn. Every movement would be an agony. For the retiarius, the constant sprinting and dodging would drain your stamina, your legs turning to rubber. A moment's carelessness, a dropped shield, a clumsy step could be the final mistake. A well-aimed thrust could find a gap in your armor. A slash could sever a tendon and send you crashing to the sand. And what happened then? What happened when you were wounded, disarmed, and at your opponent's mercy? This was the moment that truly revealed the nightmare's intricate design. You did not have the right to die. You did not even have the right to surrender to your opponent. Your fate now rested entirely in the hands of a single man, the editor, the sponsor of the games. But his decision would be guided by the collective voice of the 50,000-headed beast in the stands. If you had fought bravely, if you had provided good sport, if you had won the crowd's respect, you might have a chance. You would drop your shield and sword and raise the forefinger of your left hand. This was the universal gesture of appeal, the ad digitum, a plea for mercy. You would look not at your opponent who stood over you with his sword at your throat, but up at the roaring stands, at the sea of anonymous faces that held your life in their hands. Now the crowd would deliver its verdict. They were the ultimate judges. If they wished for you to be spared, they would wave pieces of white cloth, their handkerchiefs, and shout, "Meter, let him go," or "Release him." They might also give a sign with their hands, though the precise nature of this gesture is one of history's great and morbid debates. The popular modern image of thumbs up for life and thumbs down for death is likely a 19th century invention. The Roman gesture for mercy was probably a closed fist with the thumb tucked inside, the pollis compresso, a gesture meant to resemble a sheathed sword. But if you had fought poorly, if you had shown cowardice, if you had failed to entertain, or if the crowd was simply in a bloodthirsty mood, their verdict would be swift and merciless. They would scream, "Jugula," slit his throat. They would bay for your death. Their hand gesture would be the police verso, the turned thumb. This was not necessarily a thumb pointing down, but more likely a thumb pointed out or jabbed towards their own throat, a clear, unmistakable command for execution. The editor would watch this display, gauge the mood of the mob, and then deliver the final verdict. He was a politician, and his primary goal was to please the populace, to give them what they wanted. If the crowd roared for blood, he would almost certainly grant their wish. He would give the signal, and your opponent, your fellow gladiator, would now be forced to act as the crowd's executioner. You were expected to accept your death with a kind of theatrical courage. It was the final scene of your performance. You were not to struggle, not to weep, not to beg. The code of the gladiator, the discipline drilled into you at the ludus, demanded that you offer your throat, that you receive the final fatal blow without flinching. To die well, bene mori, was the only scrap of honor left to you. To die poorly, to die screaming and begging, was to fail in your final duty and to earn the eternal contempt of the spectators. But even a verdict of mercy, a reprieve, was not an escape. It was merely a postponement of the nightmare. Being spared, Mrs., meant you had survived to fight another day. You would be led, bleeding and exhausted, back through the gate of life, back down into the suffocating darkness of the substructures. You would be taken to the saniarium, the gladiator's infirmary, where the doctors would go to work on you. Their job was to patch you up as quickly and efficiently as possible, to sew up your wounds, to set your broken bones, and to get you ready for the next time your name appeared on the addictum. Your survival was a good outcome for the lanista. His investment had been preserved. He could now charge an even higher fee to rent you out for the next games, marketing you as a proven survivor, a crowd favorite. Your fame might grow. Children might scratch your name on walls. You might earn a small share of prize money, but the fundamental reality of your existence had not changed. You were still a slave, still infamous, still trapped in the same hopeless cycle. Each victory simply brought you one step closer to the inevitable, final defeat. The alternative to mercy was death. If the police verso was given, your opponent would step forward and complete his grim task. After he had dispatched you, attendants would rush onto the sand. This was the final, ghoulish piece of theatre. One attendant, dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the Roman underworld, would tap your forehead with a large mallet to ensure you were truly dead. Another, dressed as the god Mercury, the psychopomp who guided souls to the afterlife, would touch your body with a hot iron, a caduceus from hell, a final test for any sign of life. Once your death was confirmed, your body, now just a piece of refuse, would be unceremoniously dealt with. Slaves would rush out with hooks and drag your corpse from the arena through a special gate reserved for the dead and the animal carcasses, the Porta Libitinaria, named after the Roman goddess of funerals and burial. Your body would be dragged to the spoliarium, the stripping room. Here, your armor and any other valuable equipment would be removed to be cleaned and reused by the next man forced to play your role. Your corpse, now naked and dishonored, was the property of the state and the lanista. What happened to it next depended on your status. If you were a condemned criminal, a damnatus, your body might be thrown into the Tiber River or left for the dogs on the banks. If you were an auctoratus, a volunteer, or a prisoner of war whose contract or sentence allowed for it, your comrades from the ludus might be allowed to claim your body for burial, provided they or you had saved up enough money to pay for a funeral plot and a simple gravestone. These gravestones, many of which survive, are among the most poignant relics of the Roman world. They are the final, desperate attempts by these broken men to reclaim a scrap of their lost humanity. A stone might read, to Flamma, the secutor, who fought 34 times, won 21 times, fought to a draw 9 times, and was granted mercy 4 times. He lived 30 years. Delicatus had this made for his deserving comrade in arms. These inscriptions are a heartbreaking testament to the fragile bonds of friendship that existed within the hell of the ludus, and a final defiant cry against the erasure that the system was designed to inflict. They are a declaration, carved in stone for eternity, that despite everything, Flamma was not just a gladiator. He was a man, he had lived, and he was mourned. But for most, there would be no such dignity. There would be no stone, no inscription, no memory. There would only be the hook, the spoliarium, and the anonymous pit. Back in the amphitheater, the show was already moving on. The sand, soaked with your blood, would be raked over by slaves, a fresh, clean layer put down for the next pair of combatants. The crowd, having momentarily sated their appetite on your death, would already be turning their attention to the next fight, their roars of anticipation already beginning to build. Your entire existence, your struggle, your pain, your final, agonizing moments had been consumed and forgotten in a matter of minutes. You were a fleeting distraction, a momentary thrill, a single, bloody brushstroke in a vast canvas of industrial-scale slaughter. And the machine, the great, ravenous and unstoppable machine of the Roman games, would grind on without you. The arena was the apex of the nightmare, the bloody stage where your fate was publicly decided. But to survive the arena was not to escape the nightmare. It was merely to earn a ticket back to the suffocating, monotonous horror of your daily existence at the ludus. The life of a surviving gladiator, the life lived in the intervals between the terrifying spectacles of the munera, was a strange paradox. It was a life of fleeting fame and absolute servitude, of public adoration and private degradation, of minor celebrity and profound, soul-crushing despair. It was in these fallow periods, in the relentless, grinding routine of the barracks, that the true, long-term psychological torture of the gladiator's life took root. The fear of a swift death in combat was replaced by the slow, corrosive acid of a hopeless, cyclical existence. If you had survived your first combat, and particularly if you had won, your status within the bleak hierarchy of the ludus would subtly shift. You were no longer an untested novice, a tiro. You were now a veteran, a veteranus. You had proven that the Lannister's investment in you was not a waste. You were a valuable asset, a commodity whose market price had just increased. This brought with it certain grim advantages. You might receive a slightly better ration of food. You might be spared the most brutal and menial chores of the school. You might even earn a small share of the prize money from your victory, a handful of coins that you could save towards the impossibly remote dream of one day buying your freedom, or, more realistically, paying for your own funeral. The doctores and the Lannister might treat you with a fraction more respect, not the respect due to a human being, but the careful attention one gives to a valuable, high-performance piece of machinery. Your fame would begin to spread beyond the walls of the school. In a world without mass media, gladiators were among the most famous people in the Roman Empire. Their names and images were everywhere. The graffiti of Pompeii and other Roman cities is filled with their presence. You might see your name scratched on the wall of a tavern. Celadus the Thraex makes all the girls sigh. Or a crude drawing of your likeness, with your record of victories proudly displayed beside it. Children would play with gladiator action figures, small clay or bronze statuettes of the most popular types, like the Thraex or the Murmillo. Your face might adorn a household oil lamp or a piece of expensive glassware. For the Roman public, you were a living legend, a character in the real-life, blood-soaked soap opera of the arena. Women of all social classes, from serving girls to the wives of senators, were known to become infatuated with famous gladiators, a phenomenon that scandalized moralists like the poet Juvenal. A wealthy, married noblewoman might even pay your Lannister a staggering sum for the privilege of spending a night with you, a chance to sleep with a figure of raw, forbidden, and dangerous masculinity. But this fame was a poisoned chalice. It was a phantom, an illusion that had no bearing on the grim reality of your daily life. You might be the toast of the town, the subject of whispered fantasies in aristocratic villas, but every night you would be locked back in your stinking 6-by-8-foot cell in the ludus. You might be adored by thousands, but you were still legally infamis, a social outcast with the status of a prostitute. You were still the property of your Lannister, who could sell you, rent you, or send you to your death at his whim. The adoration of the crowd was fickle and treacherous. The same mob that chanted your name in victory today would be screaming for your throat to be slit tomorrow if you put on a poor show. The fame was not yours. It belonged to the character you played, the masked, armored killer who existed only on the sand. The celebrity was a gilded cage, its bars forged from the very system that enslaved you. It was a constant, maddening reminder of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between your public image and your private reality, a form of psychological torture that could drive a man to madness. The routine of the ludus was a soul-destroying monotony. Day after day, week after week, you would be subjected to the same grueling cycle of training, eating, and sleeping. The regimen was designed to keep you in peak physical condition, but also to prevent you from thinking, from hoping, from remembering your past life. It was a system of managed existence where every aspect of your life was controlled and monitored. There was no privacy, no autonomy, no escape from the watchful eyes of the guards and trainers. The ludus was a total institution, a world unto itself, and its primary psychological effect was to crush the individual's spirit and foster a state of learned helplessness. Within this brutal environment, a strange and complex social hierarchy emerged among the gladiators themselves. It was a microcosm of the Roman world outside, a pyramid of status built on violence and survival. At the very top were the champions, the superstars like your namesake, Flamma the Secutor, who had fought dozens of times and lived to tell the tale. These men commanded immense respect and a degree of deference from the other gladiators. They might have larger cells, better food, and more privileges. They often took on leadership roles within the familiar gladiatoria, helping the doctores to train the new recruits. A champion might become a doctor himself, or even a summa ludus, the referee in the arena. This was one of the few paths to a kind of promotion within the system, a chance to trade the terror of combat for the grim security of being an enforcer. Beneath the champions were the established veterans, the reliable fighters who had several victories under their belts. They formed the solid middle tier of the ludus hierarchy, and at the bottom were the novices, the tyrones, who were treated with contempt and subjected to the harshest treatment, their lives seen as cheap and expendable until they could prove their worth on the sand. This internal hierarchy was a powerful tool of control for the lanista. It fostered rivalry and competition, preventing the gladiators from forming a united front against their masters. It encouraged you to see your fellow gladiators not as brothers in suffering, but as rungs on a ladder you had to climb. The man in the cell next to you was not just your potential opponent in the arena, he was also your rival for a better meal, a lighter set of chains, a moment of favor from the doctor. The system turned the oppressed against each other, making them willing participants in their own subjugation. And yet, despite the system's best efforts to atomize and isolate them, genuine human bonds did form in the depths of this hell. Gladiators who were paired together in the same armatura, who trained together and faced the same kinds of opponents, often formed a strong sense of camaraderie. They would refer to each other as sodales, comrades, or even as fratres, brothers. They would share their meager earnings, look out for each other, and most importantly, honor each other in death. The funerary inscriptions are the most powerful evidence of these relationships. They speak of love, of loyalty, of grief. One gladiator, Urbicus, left a chilling and poignant piece of advice for his successor on his tombstone. "I advise you to kill the one who is coming at you." It is a statement that is both a practical piece of professional advice and a heartbreaking expression of the kill or be killed reality they all faced. These fragile bonds of friendship were a small, flickering candle of humanity in the overwhelming darkness of the ludus, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute dehumanization. But these bonds were also a source of unique and terrible pain. The system could, at any moment, turn friend against friend. While gladiators were typically pitted against their opposite type, it was not unheard of for a lanista or an editor to schedule a fight between two gladiators of the same type, even two men from the same school who had trained together as partners. Imagine the psychological horror of that moment, to stand on the sand and see, across from you, the man who you considered your brother. To know that the rules of the game now demanded that you use all the skill and knowledge you had acquired together to kill him or be killed by him. It was the ultimate perversion of their shared experience, the final, most sadistic twist of the knife by a system that delighted in turning every human connection into a potential weapon of self-destruction. The ever-present threat of death, the monotonous routine, the constant physical pain, and the psychological torment took a heavy toll. The lifespan of a gladiator was brutally short. While a handful of superstars might survive for dozens of fights over a decade or more, they were the statistical outliers, the 1 in 1,000 exceptions. Most gladiators, especially in the imperial period, would fight only a few times a year. The average gladiator probably did not survive more than 5 to 10 combats. Many, perhaps most, died in their very first appearance in the arena. The mortality rate was astronomical. Some studies suggest that in the 1st century AD, a fight to the death was the expected outcome, with a survival rate of less than 10%. By the later imperial period, the odds might have improved slightly, with a verdict of mercy becoming more common for skilled fighters, but death remained the most likely outcome of any given combat. Your life expectancy, from the moment you entered the ludus, was likely measured in months, not years. This constant proximity to a violent, almost certain death created a unique psychological state. Some men might have succumbed to a deep catatonic depression, a state of hopeless apathy. Others might have developed a kind of grim, fatalistic gallows humor, and some, undoubtedly, were driven to madness. The pressure could lead to acts of desperate self-destruction. The philosopher Seneca, in one of his letters, recounts several horrifying stories of gladiators choosing to commit suicide rather than face the terror of the arena one more time. He tells of a German captive who, on the morning he was to fight, excused himself to go to the latrine, the only place he was not guarded. There, he took the sponge on a stick that was used for personal hygiene and stuffed it down his own throat, choking himself to death. Seneca describes it not with horror, but with a kind of grudging admiration for the man's courage in choosing his own end. In another instance, he tells of a prisoner being transported to the games in a cart. The man pretended to fall asleep and then thrust his head between the spokes of the moving cartwheel, breaking his own neck. He escaped, Seneca writes, by means of the very vehicle that was carrying him to his punishment. These were not acts of cowardice. They were acts of ultimate defiance, the final, desperate assertion of will by men who had been stripped of all other choices. They were a declaration that, while the Romans could own their bodies, they could not completely own their deaths. For those who did not break, who endured year after year of this living nightmare, the goal was the rudis. The rudis was a simple wooden sword, but it was the most coveted object in the entire gladiatorial world. It was the symbol of freedom, a gladiator who had shown exceptional skill and longevity, who had survived his contracted term or had become a great champion, might be awarded the rudis by the editor in a ceremony in the arena. Its presentation was a moment of incredible drama. It signified that your contract was fulfilled, your sentence served. You were no longer a gladiator. You were a free man. You could walk out of the ludus, out of the arena, and back into the world. But what kind of freedom was it? What kind of life awaited a man who had been brutalized, traumatized, and legally dishonored for years? The transition back to civilian life was fraught with difficulty. You were still in Famis. The legal and social stigma did not simply wash away with the blood and the sand. While you might be celebrated as a hero by the mob, you would still be shunned by respectable society. Your body was a roadmap of horrific scars, your mind a landscape of traumatic memories. You were trained for nothing but spectacular violence, a skill set with limited application in a peaceful society. Some freed gladiators, the rudiarii, chose to remain in the only world they knew. They would become trainers, doctores, or referees, perpetuating the same brutal system that had created them. They would trade the terror of being a victim for the grim power of being a perpetrator. Others might find work as bodyguards for wealthy politicians or as hired muscle for criminal gangs. A very few might take their prize money and retire to a quiet life, but they were the exception. For most, the freedom of the rudis was a hollow prize. You could leave the arena, but the arena would never truly leave you. The roar of the crowd, the smell of the blood, the ghost of the man you had been forced to kill, these things would haunt your days and poison your nights for the rest of your life. The nightmare had simply changed its form, from a prison of high walls and locked gates to a more subtle, but no less inescapable, prison of the mind. The nightmare of the gladiator was not confined to the suffering of a single individual. It was a vast and intricate ecosystem of cruelty, a sprawling industry whose tentacles reached into every corner of the Roman Empire and ensnared a diverse cast of characters, each playing their own part in the great machine of slaughter. To focus solely on the man with the sword on the sand is to see only the final bloody product. To truly understand the depth and breadth of the horror, we must pull back the focus and look at the horrifying supply chain of which he was the centerpiece. We must examine the supporting cast of this grand theatre of death, the women condemned to a parallel hell, the beasts torn from their natural worlds to become props in a human drama, and the children born into a life where the roar of the arena was their first lullaby. The gladiator's nightmare was not his alone. It was a vortex that pulled in and destroyed countless other lives, often in ways even more tragic and forgotten. While the iconic image is of a male fighter, the brutal world of the ludus and the arena was not an exclusively male domain. Women, too, were drawn into its gravitational pull, their experiences forming a lesser-known but equally horrifying chapter in the story of the games. The existence of female gladiators, the gladiatresses, is a historical fact, though they were always a rare and controversial spectacle. A marble relief found at Halicarnassus, dating to the 1st or 2nd century AD, famously depicts two female gladiators named Achillea and Amazonia fighting with swords and shields, their discarded helmets at their feet. The Roman historian Tacitus and the poet Juvenal both write about them with a mixture of fascination and contempt. The gladiatrix was a profound transgression of Roman social norms. For a woman, especially a woman of the upper classes, to take up arms, to fight and bleed in public, was a shocking subversion of the Roman ideals of female modesty, domesticity, and virtue. For the most part, female gladiators were likely drawn from the same desperate pools as their male counterparts: slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Their appearance in the arena was often treated as a novelty act, a piquant and exotic addition to the games, frequently scheduled to fight at night under torchlight to enhance the sense of the spectacular and the bizarre. The sponsor of the games might pit them against each other, or sometimes against male dwarfs, another cruel juxtaposition designed to amuse and titillate the crowd. The very existence of the gladiatrix was a form of humiliation. It was a spectacle that played on Roman anxieties about gender roles, a titillating freak show that blurred the lines between masculine and feminine, warrior and victim. For the woman herself, the experience was a double nightmare. She suffered all the same physical hardships and terrors as the male gladiator: the brutal training, the constant threat of death, the legal status of infamia. But on top of this, she was subjected to a unique form of sexualized public shaming. She was a monster, a curiosity, her martial prowess viewed not with the straightforward admiration afforded to a male champion, but with a leering fascination that stripped her of both her femininity and her humanity. But the vast majority of women in the gladiatorial world were not fighters. They were silent, invisible figures whose suffering was an essential but unacknowledged part of the system. These were the wives, daughters, and lovers of the men who were dragged into the ludus. When a man was condemned to the games or sold himself into service, his family was often left destitute and disgraced. The wife of a gladiator was a widow in all but name, her husband legally dead to her, her children effectively fatherless. The social stigma of being connected to an infamous would have been immense, casting a long shadow over their own lives. Furthermore, the ludus itself was not a monastery. It was a place populated by men in their physical prime, and the sexual economy of this world was as brutal as its martial one. Female slaves were a common feature of the gladiatorial schools, their bodies the property of the lanista and his staff. They worked as cooks, cleaners, and laundresses, but their primary role was often to serve the sexual needs of the men. A lanista might use access to these women as another tool of control, a reward for a victorious gladiator, or a privilege withheld as punishment. The children born of these forced unions were born into slavery, their fate tied to the ludus from their first breath. They were the property of the lanista, another potential asset to be raised, trained, and eventually thrown into the same bloody cycle as their fathers. The gladiator's nightmare was hereditary, a poisoned inheritance passed down through the bloodline. This ecosystem of suffering was not limited to humans. The Roman arena had an insatiable appetite for the wild and the exotic, and the venaciones, the wild beast hunts, were an integral and immensely popular part of the games. This created a vast, empire-wide industry dedicated to the capture and transportation of wild animals, a supply chain of terror that reached into the most remote corners of the known world. The scale of this operation is difficult to comprehend. Roman authors boast of spectacles where thousands of animals were slaughtered in a single day. The Emperor Augustus claimed to have staged games in which 10,000 animals were killed. The Emperor Trajan, to celebrate his victory in Dacia, held games that lasted for 123 days and reportedly involved the slaughter of 11,000 animals. To supply this demand, the Roman state and private entrepreneurs organized vast hunting expeditions. Legions stationed on the frontiers were often tasked with capturing beasts as part of their duties. The deserts of North Africa were scoured for lions, leopards, and elephants. The forests of Germany and Scotland were trapped for bears and wild boars. Traders ventured as far as India for tigers and into the swamps of Egypt for crocodiles and hippos. The process of capturing these animals was a brutal and terrifying affair. Entire villages in North Africa might be conscripted into service for a great lion hunt. A large area of land would be encircled with nets, and the hunters, on foot and on horseback, would slowly close the circle, driving the terrified animals into waiting traps and cages. The mortality rate was enormous. Many animals would be killed during the hunt, or would die from stress, injury, or disease during the long and arduous journey to Rome. They would be packed into cramped wooden crates and transported by wagon and ship, a journey that could take months. Imagine the terror of a lion, a creature of the open plains, trapped in a dark, rocking box, starved and dehydrated, its senses overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sounds and smells of human civilization. By the time it reached the holding pens beneath the Colosseum, it would be a maddened, half-crazed, and pathologically aggressive shadow of its former self. This was, of course, exactly what the Romans wanted. They did not want to see a noble beast in its natural state. They wanted to see a monster, a roaring, snarling embodiment of wild chaos, which could then be heroically dispatched by the brave Venator. The arena floor itself was transformed into a theatrical landscape for these hunts. Elaborate stage machinery, a complex system of lifts, ramps, and trapdoors allowed the beasts to be suddenly released into the arena, appearing as if from nowhere to the delight of the crowd. Scenery would be erected, trees, rocks, even artificial hills, to create the illusion of a wild landscape. But the fate of the animals was never in doubt. They were there to die, and to die spectacularly. They were pitted against each other in bizarre, unnatural matchups. A bear against a lion, a bull against an elephant. Or they were hunted by the bestiarii, men armed with spears, bows, and swords. While the bestiarii were trained professionals, their work was incredibly dangerous, and many were mauled to death. But the most horrifying use of animals in the arena was for public executions. The damnatio ad bestias was considered one of the most shameful and terrifying forms of death, reserved for the lowest dregs of society, runaway slaves, prisoners of war, and members of outcast religious groups like the Christians. The victims were often unarmed, sometimes tied to stakes, and simply left to the mercy of starved and enraged animals. Christian martyrologies are filled with graphic and harrowing accounts of these executions. They tell of believers kneeling in prayer as lions were released into the arena, of men and women gored by bulls or torn apart by leopards. For the Roman crowd, this was the ultimate expression of the state's power. It was the power to condemn a human being to a death that was not even human, to be devoured like prey, their body and their identity utterly consumed by the savage forces of nature, all for the amusement of the civilized masses. The roars of the dying animals and the screams of the condemned prisoners blended together, a single, unified soundtrack for the nightmare. The sand of the arena was a sponge not just for human blood, but for the blood of an entire ecosystem, a testament to an empire so powerful it could command nature itself to participate in its rituals of death. And what of the children? What was it like to grow up in the shadow of the amphitheater? For a Roman child, the games were a normal and exciting part of life. They were a form of public education, a lesson in Roman virtues, courage, discipline, contempt for death. A father would take his son to the arena to teach him what it meant to be a Roman. The child would learn to cheer for the victor, to jeer at the coward, and to demand death for the loser with the same casual cruelty as his elders. The spectacle normalized violence violence on a scale that is almost unimaginable to us. It taught that the suffering of others, slaves, criminals, foreigners, animals, was not only acceptable, but was a legitimate and thrilling form of entertainment. The moral compass of an entire civilization was calibrated by the bloody spectacle on the sand. But for the children of the ludus itself, the experience was infinitely more direct and terrifying. A child born within the walls of the gladiatorial school, the son or daughter of a gladiator and a female slave, was born into a world of absolute horror. Their world would be bounded by the high walls of the compound. Their playground would be the sandy training yard where they would watch their father and his comrades engage in brutal practice bouts. The sound of the whip, the groans of the injured, the constant presence of violence and death. This would be the wallpaper of their childhood. They were the property of the Lannister, their lives entirely at his mercy. A young boy who showed physical promise would be identified early and groomed to follow in his father's footsteps. His childhood would be a long, slow apprenticeship for the arena. He would learn to handle the wooden sword, to build his strength, to see the world through the cold, hard eyes of a future killer. He would be taught that his father's profession, this life of enslaved celebrity and spectacular death, was his own inescapable destiny. The story of the gladiator, then, is the story of a vast and interconnected web of suffering. It is the story of the gladiatrix, whose public combat was a form of sexualized humiliation. It is the story of the wives and children left behind, condemned to a life of poverty and shame. It is the story of the female slaves of the ludus, whose bodies were just another resource to be exploited. It is the story of the thousands of lions, tigers, and bears, torn from their habitats and tortured into becoming monsters for the crowd's amusement. And it is the story of the children, both those in the stands learning to love violence and those in the ludus learning to accept it as their inheritance. The man on the sand was not an isolated figure of heroic tragedy. He was the focal point, the epicenter of a sprawling earthquake of pain. The roar of the crowd that echoed in the Colosseum was not just the sound of amusement, it was the sound of a whole civilization feasting on a banquet of despair. A feast for which every course, from the human to the animal, from the male to the female, from the adult to the child, had been prepared in the kitchens of hell. The end of a nightmare is not always a gentle awakening. Sometimes the dream of terror collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, or it is shattered by the arrival of a new and even more powerful reality. The gladiatorial games, that seemingly eternal institution at the heart of Roman identity, did not simply fade away. Their decline was a long, complex, and contested process, a slow, grinding dissolution driven by the confluence of three powerful forces: economic decay, philosophical critique, and the inexorable rise of a new and uncompromising faith that saw the spectacles not as entertainment, but as demonic worship. The end of the arena was not a single event, but a war of attrition waged over centuries, a struggle for the very soul of the Roman world. To trace this decline is to witness the slow death of the nightmare, and to understand how a civilization, after centuries of bloodlust, finally, haltingly, began to wake up. The first cracks in the edifice of the games were economic. The munera were, from their inception, an exercise in extravagant, conspicuous consumption. The cost of staging a major gladiatorial event was astronomical. The sponsor, the editor, was expected to spend a fortune. This included the immense cost of acquiring and training the gladiators themselves, the fees paid to the Lannister to rent his best fighters, the expense of capturing, transporting, and feeding thousands of wild animals for the venaciones, the cost of maintaining the amphitheater, the payment for the musicians, the attendants, the sign painters, and often the distribution of free food and drink to the populace to ensure a festive atmosphere. For an ambitious politician in the late Republic, staging lavish games was a necessary, if ruinous, investment in his political career, a way to buy the favor of the masses. For the emperors, the games became an essential tool of statecraft, a key part of the bread and circuses policy designed to keep the volatile Roman mob placated and distracted. But this system, built on endless growth and conquest, was unsustainable. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire entered a period of profound and protracted crisis. The age of rapid expansion was over. The flow of wealth and slaves from newly conquered territories slowed to a trickle. The empire was beset by chronic civil wars, with ambitious generals repeatedly marching on Rome to claim the imperial throne. The currency was debased, leading to rampant inflation. Plagues swept through the population, decimating the tax base and the military. In this new reality of economic scarcity and political instability, the sheer, mind-boggling expense of the traditional games became an increasingly unbearable burden. Emperors and magistrates still staged games, but they were often smaller, less spectacular affairs. The thousands of beasts slaughtered in Trajan's day gave way to dozens. The great troops of highly trained gladiators were harder to assemble. The supply chain of terror, which had stretched to the ends of the earth, began to fray and break down. The nightmare was becoming too expensive to produce. Alongside this economic decay, a quiet but persistent intellectual and philosophical critique of the games had been simmering for centuries. While the vast majority of Romans accepted the munera as a normal and enjoyable part of life, a small but influential number of thinkers began to question their morality. These were not radical revolutionaries calling for abolition, but philosophers and moralists expressing a deep sense of unease and disgust. Their critique was not based on a modern, universal concept of human rights, an idea that would have been utterly alien to them. They did not argue that a slave or a criminal had a right to life. Instead, their objections were rooted in traditional Roman aristocratic values, particularly the Stoic ideal of self-control, dignity, and inner tranquility. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, who we have already met, provides the most powerful and eloquent expression of this critique. While he accepted the execution of criminals as a necessary function of the state, he was profoundly horrified by the way the arena turned justice into a spectacle of frenzied, bloodthirsty entertainment. For Seneca, the true danger of the games was not to the bodies of the gladiators, but to the souls of the spectators. He believed that exposing oneself to such raw, unrestrained violence and passion was morally corrupting. He wrote, "There is nothing so damaging to good character as to settle down for the idle pleasure of a spectacle, for it is then that vices creep into you most easily through the avenue of pleasure." He argued that the crowd, in its collective frenzy, stripped individuals of their reason and their self-control, transforming them into a single, savage beast. I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more voluptuous, and even more cruel and inhuman because I have been among human beings. For Seneca, the gladiator, in his disciplined acceptance of death, could sometimes be an admirable figure. The real horror, the real moral nightmare, was in the stands. Other writers, like the satirist Juvenal, attacked the games from a different angle, seeing them as a symptom of a decadent and morally bankrupt society. He mocked the upper-class women who became infatuated with gladiators, and the aristocrats who, seeking a thrill, would disgrace their family names by fighting in the arena themselves. For these critics, the problem with the games was not so much the cruelty itself, but the loss of dignity, the blurring of social boundaries, and the elevation of base, vulgar entertainment over more noble pursuits. This philosophical critique was a minority view, a quiet voice of dissent easily drowned out by the roar of the crowd. It did not lead to any widespread movement for reform, but it planted a seed of doubt. It created a vocabulary of moral unease, a sense that even if the games were necessary, there was something deeply and fundamentally wrong with them, something that gnawed at the core of Roman virtue. But the force that would ultimately deliver the death blow to the gladiatorial nightmare was not economic decline or philosophical disgust. It was the rise of a new religion, a faith born in a despised corner of the empire that preached a radical and uncompromising new message about the nature of God, humanity, and suffering. This was Christianity. The early Christian relationship with the arena was one of terror and martyrdom. For the first 3 centuries of their existence, Christians were a persecuted minority, and the arena was often the final destination for those who refused to renounce their faith. They were the victims of the damnatio ad bestias, the human props in the midday executions. The stories of their martyrdoms, of Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who welcomed the lions that would devour him, of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, a noblewoman and her slave who faced the beasts together with serene courage, became foundational texts of the new faith. For Christians, the amphitheater was not a place of entertainment. It was a demonic space, a temple of pagan idolatry and human sacrifice. The gods of the Romans were their demons, and the games were a ritual performed in their honor. To attend the games for a Christian was to participate in an act of apostasy. The early church fathers launched a furious and sustained rhetorical assault on the games. Tertullian, a fiery North African writer of the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, wrote a treatise, De Spectaculis, on the spectacles, which was a blistering condemnation of all forms of Roman public entertainment, but he reserved his most venomous prose for the amphitheater. He called it the temple of all the demons, a place where human blood gives pleasure. He systematically dismantled every possible justification for the games. Were they a display of courage? No, he argued, it was a display of trained savagery. Were they a just punishment for criminals? No, they were an excuse for public butchery. For Tertullian, the gladiatorial combat was a form of murder, and to watch it was to become complicit in that murder. The man who enjoys the spectacle of a man being killed, he thundered, is a worse sinner than the man who does the killing. The Christian message was absolute and uncompromising. You could not be a follower of Christ and a fan of the Gladiator. You had to choose. For centuries, this Christian critique was the voice of a persecuted minority, but in the early 4th century, the world turned upside heels. In 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine, on the eve of a decisive battle for control of the empire, supposedly had a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign you will conquer." He won the battle, and over the course of his reign, he transformed Christianity from a persecuted cult into the favored religion of the Roman state. The Edict of Milan in 313 granted official tolerance to Christianity, and by the end of the century, under the Emperor Theodosius, it would become the official state religion, with paganism being actively suppressed. This seismic shift in the religious landscape spelled the beginning of the end for the gladiatorial games. The first official imperial prohibition came from Constantine himself in 325 AD. In a decree sent to the provincial governors in the east, he condemned the bloody spectacles and ordered that condemned criminals should be sent to the mines instead of the ludus, so that they may pay the penalty for their crimes without shedding their blood. However, this decree seems to have been more of a statement of intent than an effective empire-wide ban. The tradition was too old, too popular, and too deeply ingrained in Roman culture to be eliminated with a single stroke of the pen. Games continued to be held, especially in the western part of the empire and in Rome itself, where the traditionalist senatorial aristocracy clung to the old ways. Subsequent Christian emperors issued further condemnations, but the final fatal blow to the institution may have come not from an imperial decree, but from a single, dramatic act of self-sacrifice. The story is told by the 5th century church historian Theodoret. Around the year 404 AD, a Christian monk from the east named Telemachus journeyed to Rome, determined to put a stop to the bloody spectacles. He went to the Colosseum during a gladiatorial contest, and filled with righteous horror, he rushed down into the arena and threw himself between the two combatants, pleading with them to stop. The crowd, enraged at this interruption of their entertainment, this violation of their sacred ritual, turned on him. They began to stone him, screaming for his death. The editor of the games, shocked and furious, ordered the gladiators to kill the monk who was ruining their show. They cut him down on the sand. But according to Theodoret, the monk's martyrdom had a profound effect. The Christian emperor Honorius, who was in Rome at the time, was so moved and shamed by the monk's heroic sacrifice that he was finally spurred to action. He officially banned all gladiatorial contests in the city of Rome. While the historical accuracy of the Telemachus story is debated by modern scholars, it may be a pious legend created to give a dramatic end to the story. It captures a powerful symbolic truth. It illustrates the fundamental incompatibility of the old Roman worldview and the new Christian one. The selfless, non-violent sacrifice of the monk stood in stark, irreconcilable contrast to the violent for-profit spectacle of the gladiator. The story represents the moment when the moral force of the new faith finally overcame the ancient bloodlust of the old world. The last reliably recorded gladiatorial combat in the city of Rome took place around 404 AD. The beast hunts, the venaciones, which did not involve the killing of humans, were considered less morally objectionable and continued for another century. But they too eventually petered out as the Western Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of barbarian invasions and economic collapse. The great amphitheaters fell into disuse. The Colosseum, that great monument to organized death, was repurposed. It became a fortress for medieval barons, a quarry for building materials for Renaissance palaces, a shelter for the homeless, and finally, a romantic, ivy-clad ruin, a tourist attraction and a symbol of a fallen empire. The nightmare was over. The roar of the crowd had finally fallen silent, replaced by the wind whistling through the empty arches. The sand, once soaked with the blood of thousands, was now covered with grass and wildflowers. The great machine of death, after centuries of relentless operation, had finally, definitively, ground to a halt, leaving behind only ghosts and a profound, chilling lesson about the depths of cruelty to which a civilized society can descend when it decides that the suffering of some is a small price to pay for the entertainment of others. The silence that fell over the amphitheaters of the Roman world was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a civilization in its death throes, the quiet that follows the collapse of a great and terrible machine. The Western Roman Empire, the political and economic engine that had powered the gladiatorial nightmare for half a millennium, was itself being bled to death, not by the clean cuts of the gladius, but by the thousand deeper wounds of barbarian invasion, political decay, and economic ruin. The end of the games was not a clean moral victory, a sudden dawning of enlightenment. It was a slow, messy, and multifaceted process, a gradual fading of a tradition that had simply become too expensive, too controversial, and too fundamentally at odds with the new Christian soul of Europe. The great stone bowls of death, like the Colosseum, emptied of their crowds and their victims, began their long transformation into the ruins we see today. Monuments not to glory, but to a profound and cautionary horror. To stand in the ruins of the Colosseum now is to stand in the skeletal remains of the nightmare. It is to feel the weight of the millions of lives, both human and animal, that were systematically extinguished on that patch of ground for the sake of a spectacle. The story of the gladiator, when stripped of its romantic veneer, is a chilling testament to the human capacity for systematized cruelty and the terrifying power of mass delusion. It reveals a society that perfected the art of dehumanization, that turned human beings into legal ghosts, branded them as infamies, and then reforged them into celebrity killing machines for profit. It was a world that celebrated courage while enforcing slavery, that adored its heroes while legally defining them as filth. This paradox is the central, unsettling truth of the gladiator's existence. The nightmare operated on every conceivable level. It was a physical nightmare of relentless training, of a diet designed to create a more pleasingly butcherable body, of wounds that were patched up only so they could be reopened in the next fight. It was a legal nightmare, a state of civic death where one's body was no longer one's own, but a piece of property to be leased, sold, and ultimately destroyed. It was a psychological nightmare, an existence of constant fear, of gnawing hopelessness, of being forced to murder men with whom you shared a bond of common suffering. It was a social nightmare, the bizarre state of being both a celebrated superstar and a despised outcast, an object of public lust and of public contempt. And it was a spiritual nightmare, a world presided over by Nemesis, the goddess of vengeance, where your only hope for an afterlife was to die in a way that pleased the very mob that was screaming for your death. The legacy of this nightmare is not just in the ruins of the amphitheaters or the poignant inscriptions on the tombstones of forgotten fighters. Its legacy is embedded in our own culture, in the complex and often troubling relationship we have with violence as entertainment. The gladiator's ghost still haunts our modern spectacles. It lingers in the language of our sports, where we still refer to stadiums as arenas and talk of athletes as warriors going into battle. It is present in the way we elevate athletes to the status of heroes while simultaneously treating them as commodities. their bodies subject to the pressures of multi-million-dollar contracts, intense media scrutiny, and the risk of life-altering injury for our amusement. It echoes in the dark corners of combat sports, where the line between athletic competition and brutal spectacle can become perilously thin. While our modern entertainments are a world away from the state-sanctioned slaughter of the Roman arena, the fundamental dynamic, the consumption of real human struggle and risk as a form of leisure, is a faint but undeniable echo of the roar that once filled the Colosseum. The Gladiator was the ultimate product of a society that believed in its own absolute supremacy. The Roman Empire, in its own mind, stood at the center of the civilized world. Everyone else, the barbarian, the provincial, the slave, the criminal, was lesser, their lives of less value, their suffering of no consequence. The arena was the place where this belief was made brutally, viscerally real. It was a ritual that constantly reaffirmed Rome's power over all its conquered peoples, over the animal kingdom, and over the fundamental laws of life and death itself. The gladiator, often a captive from a conquered land, was forced to perform his own subjugation, his death a final, symbolic victory for the empire that had enslaved him. But the story also contains a final, desperate glimmer of defiance. It is the story of the men who chose to choke themselves on a filthy sponge rather than be paraded for the mob. It is the story of the slave rebel Spartacus, who, in the century before the empire, turned his gladiatorial school into the heart of a massive slave army that shook the Roman Republic to its core, a brief, glorious, and doomed fight for freedom against impossible odds. It is the story of the monk Telemachus, whether historical or legendary, who threw his own life away in a final, defiant protest against the spectacle of death. And it is in the simple, heartbreaking words carved on a tombstone, a final attempt by one Sodalis to honor his fallen comrade, to reclaim a name from the abyss of erasure and declare to the world that here lay not just a product, not just a spectacle, but a man who was loved and who was mourned. These are the small acts of resistance, the flickers of humanity that refuse to be extinguished even in the deepest, most suffocating darkness of the nightmare. They are the proof that even when a system is designed to strip away everything that makes us human, the spirit can sometimes find a way to fight back, even if the only available weapon is the choice of how one dies. The silence that eventually fell upon the arena was a profound moment in the moral history of humanity. It represented the triumph of a new idea, the radical Christian notion that every human life, even that of a slave or a criminal, possessed an intrinsic, God-given value, and that human suffering was not a subject for public amusement, but a sacred mystery to be approached with compassion and awe. The end of the games was a declaration that a society could change, that it could look into the abyss of its own cruelty and, however slowly and reluctantly, decide to turn away. The ghosts of the gladiators are a permanent and necessary warning. They remind us of the terrifying ease with which a society can normalize the unthinkable. They remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism is never as clear as we like to think, and that the roar of the crowd can be the most dangerous sound in the world. The nightmare is over, the stones are cold, but the lesson, written in a language of blood and sand, is one we forget at our own peril. Thank you for lending us a moment of your time, for walking with us back into the darkness of the ludus and the blinding, terrible light of the arena. It is by confronting the reality of these historical nightmares, by staring unflinchingly at the ghosts of the past, that we can hope to better understand the responsibilities of the present. The fundamental question posed by the gladiator's existence remains as potent and relevant as ever. What kind of spectacle are we willing to tolerate, and what is the human cost of our own entertainment? The answer to that question defines the soul of any civilization. And so, our time on the sand is over. The great amphitheater falls silent, the roar of 100,000 voices now just an echo carried on the wind of 2,000 years. The dust has settled, the blood has long since dried, and the ghosts of the fallen have been given their voice. We have walked with them through the gates of the ludus, felt the sting of the trainer's rod, tasted the bland despair of the barley man's diet, and stood blinking in the terrible, unforgiving light of the arena. We have heard the baying of the crowd, the clash of steel, the final, ragged breath of the defeated. We have borne witness to a nightmare engineered with the full, remorseless genius of a world-conquering empire. But that world and its terrors are far from here. The world of marble and blood, of iron and fear, recedes now, back into the deep well of the past. It cannot reach you here. In the safety and quiet of your own space, under the gentle watch of the moon or the distant sleeping hum of the city outside your window, there is no lanista to claim your body, no police verso to command your death, no trumpet call to slaughter. Those sounds are phantoms now, spectres of history we have summoned only to understand and now to let go. The men we have spoken of tonight knew little of peace and even less of restful sleep. For them, the darkness was not a time for rest, but a time of confinement in a barred cell, the silence filled not with tranquility, but with the groans of the wounded and the palpable dread of the coming dawn. Their sleep was a shallow, fitful thing, haunted by the memory of the faces they had killed and the terror of the faces they had yet to face. But your darkness is different. It is a sanctuary. The bed where you lie is not a stone slab in a prison, but a place of comfort and repose. The silence that surrounds you is not one of fear, but of peace. The shadows in your room hold no threat. They are simply the absence of light, a gentle invitation to rest. Let the ghosts we have summoned tonight fade with the telling of their story. They have no power here. They are whispers in the long, dark corridor of history, and their purpose now is only to remind us of the profound, simple, and precious luxury of a quiet, undisturbed night. They have played their part. Their tragedy has served its purpose, to illuminate the darkness of their world, so that we may better appreciate the light and the quiet of our own. The story is done. The nightmare is over. All that is left now is the stillness of your room, the gentle weight of your blanket, and the slow, steady, peaceful rhythm of your own breathing. There are no more crowds to please, no more battles to fight. The arena is empty. The gates are closed. Let the last echoes of that distant, terrible world fade away completely. Let the silence be total. Let your mind be still. So close your eyes. Rest now. Good night.